This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, I'm standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and Siobhan and I both like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join for $60 Australian if you're a waged academic and only $15 Australian if you are unwaged. And unwaged here includes students and those who are precariously waged. ASA does lots of great things to support the animal studies community around the world. Did you know, for example, that the ASA website has a gallery championing the work of artists in the animal studies space? This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series. This is a series from Sydney University Press focused on animal studies. 1st of January will see the release of the next book in the series, which is Dingo Bold, The Life and Death of Kagari Dingoes, which is by Rowena Lennox. Dingo Bold draws upon ecology, social science and literature to ask what we know about the history of human-dingo relationships. And I know this topic will be of great interest to lots of listeners. So why don't you take a look at the Animal Publics website to learn more about Dingo Bold and about the other books in the series. This week on Knowing Animals, we're joined by Kim Stallwood. Kim is an independent academic and activist who has authored a wide range of scholarly and popular pieces on human-animal relationships. And he's someone who's been involved in animal advocacy, including leadership and consultancy positions with a number of very well-known animal advocacy organisations for a large number of years. And today we're going to be talking about his paper, A Felicitous Day for Fish, which was published in Edinburgh University Press's 2020 collection, Brigid Brophy, Avant-Garde Writer, Critic, Activist. And this book was edited by Richard Canning and Gerri Kimber. We're also going to talk about the Kim Stallwood Archive, which will surely be an important resource for animal studies scholars for years to come. Welcome to the podcast, Kim.
Thank you, Josh.
So I just wanted to start by asking about the title of this paper, because it strikes me as a really nice title, A Felicitous Day for Fish. Where does that come from?
A Felicitous Day for Fish comes from a paper that Brigid Brophy wrote and presented at the inaugural meeting of the Council for the Prevention of Cruelty by Angling. And this meeting, which I attended in 1981 in London, was where Brophy read out the paper, A Felicitous Day for Fish, which I discussed in the chapter in the Brophy anthology.
So what was it that inspired you to work on Brigid Brophy's work and life?
I've been a fan of Brophy since I first heard her speak at the RSPCA Animal Rights Conference at Trinity College, Cambridge in 1977. I really liked her dry wit and piercing argument that she made in support of animal rights. And I discovered that in 1965 that she'd written an article for the Sunday Times in London called The Rights of Animals. And that article I've always thought was the founding moment of the contemporary animal rights movement.
That's interesting. So I suspect that she's someone who a lot of listeners may have kind of roughly heard of, but not really know much about her. But I suspect there'll be quite a lot of listeners who maybe haven't heard of her at all. So can you try and summarise who she was?
She was many things. She was a somewhat what we would now call a media celebrity. She wrote novels. She wrote articles for publication in newspapers. She championed legislation in Britain that enabled authors to get a small payment for when their books were borrowed in public libraries. And the anthology edited by Richard Canning and Gerri Kimber that's called Brigid Brophy, Avant-Garde Writer, Critic and Activist really does provide a outstanding introduction to Brophy, her life and her work.
So why do you think that animal studies scholars in particular should pay attention to her work?
Well, historically, she wrote two very important pieces that to do with animals. The first was one of her novels, which was published in the early 1950s. I forget right now exactly the year, but it's called A Hackenfeller's Ape, and it's the story of a fictitious ape in London Zoo. And in the novel, Brophy discusses the keeping of animals in zoos, sending animals up into space, and parallels the keeping of animals in zoos with the keeping of people in prisons. And it was a forerunner of what one could call an animal rights novel. And then there's the second publication of the essay in 1965, The Rights of Animals. So she predated the novel, the philosophers who we're more familiar with, who we sort of associate with the beginning of the modern animal rights movement, people like Singer and Reagan, for example. She predated them, and she advocated a philosophy of animal rights, which was uncompromising, and it also was laced with this acid wit of hers, which I really appreciated.
Yes. So in this particular paper, A Felicitous Day for Fish, you mentioned both of those works, I think, but you're focusing on her advocacy specifically for fish. So could you tell us a bit about the work that she did in that area?
Well, the inaugural meeting of the Council for the Prevention of Cruelty by Angling was in 1981 and in London. And at that time, there was very little attention given by the animal movement toward fish. And it's only really recently, within the last few years, that the animal movement has focused more on the commercial side of fishing. We're still not even focusing on angling, which is the fishing equivalent of hunting animals with dogs to kill foxes and so on. And she was, I think, a pioneer in that regard. And there was the opportunity to contribute to a conference and then to this anthology. And because I worked with her on the organizing of this inaugural meeting, I wanted to use the conference and the anthology as an opportunity to remind everyone of the pivotal role that Brophy made in the formation of the animal rights movement before it really sort of took off after Singer's publication of Animal Liberation in 1975.
So could you tell us a little bit more about these kind of early efforts to challenge fishing and angling?
There weren't many efforts at that time. It was more about putting a stake in the ground and saying, we have to talk about fish. And this was an inaugural meeting of a new organization, which lived for a number of years, but then sadly went into decline. And the meeting was attended by a very small number of people. So these were very early steps in raising the issue of fish within the animal rights movement. And I think that Brophy's contribution to the meeting, A Felicitous Day for Fish, is really the outstanding moment of these very early steps. There were people who did interrupt some angling competitions with equivalent of doing hunt sabotage work, but they weren't as widespread as people sabbing hunts was at that time and increasingly today.
I see that this paper drew upon material from your archive. So, for example, the early newsletters of these organisations. And I understand that you actually have some quite exciting news about your archive to share. What's that?
Well, the exciting news is that there is now at the British Library the Kim Stallwood Archive. And the British Library came to my office recently and took away 36 boxes of research material. And in this research material were about 800 plus files broken down into three categories of people, organisations and subjects. And one of the people files was a file on Brigid Brophy, and another file was on the Council for the Prevention of Cruelty by Angling. So when I wrote the chapter for the Brophy anthology, I found those files, the Brophy file and the anti-angling organisational file, and used the materials which I kept from the early 1980s, including the text of the speech that she made, and used those materials to write the chapter that was published in the Brophy book. The British Library also took 2 old laptops of mine to download the contents of the laptops to add to the paper collection of the archive, what's called born digital materials. So I've learned that archives now talk in terms of paper materials, the 800 plus files, but also born digital materials, which are documents written on a computer, not created on paper, but are still documents that need to be preserved in an archive.
I see. So presumably this archive contains an awful lot of things that would be very hard to find today. So I'd imagine, for example, the text of Brophy's speech that we were just talking about would be something that would be very difficult to come by. I can't imagine I'd find it in my university library, for example. So could you give us an indication of the kinds of things that are included in the archive?
The archive includes correspondence from the late 1970s, early 1980s with key activists, both in Britain and in the United States. I first went to the United States in 1980, then twice in 1981. And in the late 1970s, I was beginning a pen pal relationship with Jim Mason in the United States, who was at that time researching his book, Animal Factories, that was co-authored with Peter Singer. So this research, and including correspondence that I had with Ingrid Newkirk in the early 1980s, correspondence with people like Jim Mason and Ingrid Newkirk and others, they discuss the status of the movement at that time and discuss the strategies and tactics that we were wanting to implement and indeed got round to implementing. So this correspondence and other related papers is very much the substance of the debate that we were having at that time about getting the modern animal rights movement off the ground.
And will all of the archive be available to researchers in the British Library?
Most of the archive will be available to researchers once it's been catalogued and preserved. There are some materials of a sensitive nature which I placed a 25-year embargo on, so they'll be available, in years to come.
I see. So, have you got any indication of when this cataloguing will be complete?
The British Library tell me that they reckon it will take about a year for it to be catalogued, and then inventory is made available for people to access at their building in London.
I see. What sort of research can you imagine being done with this archive then?
I think the research will focus upon the formative stages of the animal movement and the discussions which activists were having in the late 1970s, early 1980s, of how to form organizations, how to challenge existing organizations so that they become more active. There was very much a tension happening at this time between the traditional animal welfare organizations and people and with the emerging world of animal rights activists and animal rights organizations. And the papers in my archive are very much focused upon those materials. There's also, at the time of the early 1980s and late 1970s, very much a collection of organizations and the publications they produced at that time. And many of those organizations no longer exist, and most likely the materials which they produced at that time won't be easily and readily available in the way in which mine was. For reasons which I don't really understand about myself, I just collected material published by organizations as soon as I became a vegetarian in 1974 and then a vegan in 1976, and kept these materials in an organized way because I used them for my work as a full-time animal rights activist since 1976. And they do very much encapsulate that time and those activities of that time.
Yes. Well, you reminded me when you were talking there about these questions about political strategy and about the conflict between animal rights and animal welfare, for example, or the potential conflict. This is still a debate that's very much going on today. And I was quite struck by the paper you've written on Brigid Brophy. Some of her comments about building coalitions and about the difference between the right and the left. And although she identified with the left, she maybe didn't have as much love for the left as do some other lefties, in her words. So I was, and I know that this is something you've thought about a lot as well. So am I right in saying that both you and Brigid Brophy, but perhaps not some of the other people who you're corresponding with, who are detailed in the archive, are prepared to build coalitions with people who perhaps have quite different political views?
Yeah, that's a very important question to ask. I mean, both the modern movement or contemporary movement and the movement against animal research in the late 1800s, there are key similarities here in that both movements include a tension between those who are abolitionists and those who are step-by-step regulators. And in the Victorian anti-vivisection movement, there were two organizations. One advocated total abolition and the other advocated step-by-step reform. And there was a tension and conflict between them. And each organization was led by two charismatic and strong-minded women. The abolitionist was Frances Power Cobb, who led the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And the regulatory agency was Anna Kingsford, who led the National Anti-Vivisection Society. And today there is still the debate that goes on between how much compromise do we make moving away from a vegan animal rights point of view. I learned from Peter Roberts, who co-founded Compassion in World Farming, when I worked with him in the late 1970s, that it was important to build coalitions. Peter Roberts was a dairy farmer who discovered how battery chicken farming for eggs was increasingly becoming a form of agriculture that he was encouraged to go into instead of being a dairy farmer. And he eventually made the transition from being a meat-eating dairy farmer with his family, his wife, to being a vegetarian, vegan, animal rights person who co-founded Compassion in World Farming. And I learned that with Compassion in World Farming that you do have to do some balancing between what I now call a utopian vision of animal rights with a pragmatic politics of animal welfare. And the trick is being able to successfully balance the two. Each needs the other. Not one single way is going to achieve the goal we want to achieve. We need both, and we need both to work in tandem with each other to help propel the strengths and weaknesses of each to move forward for animals.
I see. Now, you're someone who's been very involved with animal activism for a long, long time. And so I'd like to ask quite a big question. Do you think things are getting better for animals?
That's always an impossible question to answer. And it depends upon the day of the week, Josh, to be honest with you, as to how I answer the question. In some respects, yes, things are improving. People's awareness, people's attitudes are more enlightened than they were, certainly from the time when I went vegetarian in the 1970s. and the availability of food and other products to buy that's vegan, that's not tested on animals, that doesn't have animal ingredients. All of that is significantly better than it was when I went vegan and vegetarian. There was virtually nothing or very little available at that time, and it still amazes me that I can go into a supermarket and buy vegan products and be marketed that way. So that's a positive. The negative is that the numbers of animals being abused is increasing. The scale of the abuse, the numbers of animals abused, including fish, is just beyond comprehension. And I don't feel optimistic in that regard. I certainly don't feel optimistic within the context of the related issue of climate change and the big impact that the exploitation of animals has within climate change. We as a species, as humans, still have a lot to learn and a lot to understand. And I'm not confident that we will really learn about the impact that we are having on the planet, including other animals, until we are forced to confront it because of catastrophes which we created that are somewhat beyond our control.
Yes. Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying there, and I have similar feelings myself. So, Kim, I ask everyone who comes on the show to answer 5 quick questions. Now, I'm quite excited about your answers to these questions because I have no trouble thinking of you as an academic, but nonetheless, you're not someone who, say, worked in a university. So you produce academic work, but you don't necessarily work in the usual academic environment. So are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm as ready as I'll ever be.
Good. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Well, Josh, you're going to be not surprised that I'm not going to always directly answer the question. So I want to answer the first question by saying the RSPCA's Animal Rights Conference at Trinity College, Cambridge in 1977, which I was very fortunate to attend with Peter Roberts of Compassionate World Farming, was not the first piece of large scholarship I read, but it was the first opportunity I had to hear speakers present papers who many who I'd never heard of, but subsequently some I then went on to work with. So such people as Brigid Brophy presented there, Richard Ryder, Tom Reagan, Andrew Lindsay, and others. And that was not a reading experience, but it was a learning experience that made a considerable impact upon me at that time and continues to reverberate throughout the years.
Yes. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
The first published piece was in an anthology edited by Robert Garner called Animal Rights, The Changing Debate. And this was published in 1996. And the piece is titled Utopian Visions and Pragmatic Politics, Challenging the Foundations of Speciesism and Mesotheory.
Yes, good. I ordered a copy of that book quite recently, actually, but it's sadly out of print, so I haven't received it yet. I was interested to see what, including your paper, what people were saying about these kinds of debates that we're still having now, but a comparatively long time ago, back in the 90s. So that's very interesting.
I also want to recommend then to you the anthology published as a result of the RSPCA's 1977 Animal Rights Conference. And that anthology is called Animal Rights, a Symposium, which is edited by David Patterson and Richard Ryder. And that encapsulates the thinking at the time in the mid to late 1970s.
Yes, good. Yeah, good recommendation. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who has had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I'm going to name 2. The first is Ken Shapiro, who we co-founded the Animals and Society Institute. And Ken, in our various informal discussions and working together in various capacities, taught me a lot about animal studies. And the second is Carol Adams, who in different situations and different circumstances also taught me a lot to understand about animal studies and a deeper thinking about our relationship with animals.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Fundamentally, I think the most important thing they can do is to teach respect and compassion for all life.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Stop eating them. Stop using them.
Yes, good. I like it. So what is it you're working on next?
I've got two major projects underway. One is the continuation of my archive. The British Library did not take everything that I have in my collection, which is in my office here in Hastings, England. So I am presently in negotiations with another institute who is very interested and wanting to take the remaining part of the collection that's here. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make that happen. And then the second major project I'm working on is writing the biography of an elephant called Topsy, who was electrocuted to death in 1903. And that project is taking quite a long time to pull together, but it's being squeezed out by other work. But I'm increasingly spending my time writing that biography. Then I also want to mention last that I serve on the board of the Culture and Animals Foundation, which was founded in 1985 by the philosopher Tom Regan and his wife Nancy Regan. And the work of the organization continues by having an annual grant program and generally supporting scholars, students and artists and creatives in their work in advancing the consciousness for animals.
How can people find out more about your work?
The best way is through first my website, which is www.kimstallwood.com. And then I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as the Grumpy Vegan. And I'm also on Instagram as well, and also on Goodreads. I do like to read books, and when I can, I do write reviews about them and get posted there.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Kim, and thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today.
You're very welcome, and it's been a great honour.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about Knowing Animals and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.